Hello and welcome to the Digital Power China podcast, the podcast where we discuss the intensifying geopolitics of digital technology, China's role in it, and the implications for Europe, the European Union, and specifically also this time the United Kingdom. Now, the Digital Power China Research Consortium is publishing a new report these days where we look into reverse dependencies. So, over the last couple of months and maybe even years, Europe has been considering how to reduce strategic dependencies from China and make itself more secure, more independent, more sovereign, and preserve the freedom that we have. But there's a second side to this story, and this is that also China needs us. And the question is, how can we make sure to maintain this reverse dependency that also the Chinese continue to rely on us? The Digital Power China Research Consortium has prepared a new report. Each of the chapters are written by small interdisciplinary teams consisting of engineers on the one side, but also China scholars. And I have a group of wonderful colleagues with me today for this podcast where we discuss a few of the insights that we delve into in much more detail into this report, and we hope that you find this interesting. So I will introduce them while I'll ask them the first question, and I start with Jan-Peter Kleinhans, who is an engineer by training and works at the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, a technology think tank in Berlin. And Jan-Peter, I would be really interested, why do you think is it so important to look at these reverse dependencies? What could be the role of European state actors? I mean, after all, what we do know is that technology strength normally comes from companies or from individual researchers, from research institutions. So, as policymakers in the European Union, why would we need to think about these reverse dependencies in the first place? You have done fascinating research on the semiconductor industry, but could you elaborate a bit? Why is that important in your opinion?
Sure. I think ultimately you already touched on this that it is in Europe's best interest to ensure long term reverse dependencies because this comes with geopolitical leverage. So ultimately, having a seat at the table and ensuring that, for example, if the Chinese government wants to go against European security interests, that there is leverage also through technology ecosystems that Europe has at its disposal. But in order to have this, reverse dependencies are necessary. And then, as you mentioned, which also becomes clear in the report, every single technology ecosystem works differently, and reverse dependencies have different characteristics, different shapes, different forms in each technology ecosystem. So I think for policymakers, it is crucial to better understand the characteristics, the longevity of each in each technology ecosystem and its reverse dependencies toward China. And then ultimately to inform Europe's industrial policy, to inform Europe's protect and promote measures to ultimately ensure that even in 10 years' time and beyond, there are reverse dependencies where China depends on European technology and cannot go against European security or foreign policy interests.
Thanks, JP. I mean, we will delve a bit more further throughout this discussion into the question on the role of the state or also the European Commission, so public actors and what they can really do. I would like to bring in Sanne van der Lucht, who is a research fellow at the Leiden Asia Center in the Netherlands. You've been working on artificial intelligence, more specifically in the health sector, but also you have been watching China's technology policy for quite a while. So I'm curious, maybe with reference to one or two examples. Could you explain to us a bit sort of what is in China the role of the state? I mean, we tended always to think that state involvement is actually negative for innovation, negative for the commercialization, because states don't know as well as private actors what is commercially viable, etc. But what's the role of the state in China?
Yes, that role is huge. That actually already started in 2015 when China announced the Made in China 2025 strategy. The goal of that was to get rid of the dependencies China had on EU and European and American companies, especially in advanced technologies. And there they announced AI as one of the key technologies to look at. And then they went a step further in 2017 with the next generation artificial intelligence development plan, which laid out their plan to become the world leader in AI in 2030. And part of this plan was to help develop national champions. And this is actually very similar to the successful strategy that the Chinese government used to set up the telecom equipment industry in China in the 90s. Basically, the moment a Chinese company managed to develop a technology which was very similar to a Western technology, the Chinese government restricted the access of foreign suppliers to the Chinese market and also pushed Chinese companies to buy from local suppliers. And this is what we have also now been seeing happening in the medical AI technology sector, which is the sector that we have been looking at for the report right now. And to then give an example is China's National Medical Products Administration. They require that data that is used to train medical AI devices, that data is sourced from Chinese citizens. So as a consequence, Siemens, for example, they developed AI software specifically for the Chinese market, most likely using Chinese companies. And Philips decided to buy its AI software package completely from Chinese suppliers, which means that these European companies, Siemens and Philips, they don't have a competitive advantage over their Chinese competitors in their AI software. And I think what's also important to mention is that also the medical equipment sector by itself was also selected as one of the key sectors in this Made in China 2025 strategy, which means that the Chinese government also supported the development of hardware for medical devices, like, for example, the very strong magnets used in MRI scanners. And China is currently producing already 45% of these world's strongest magnets. And last year, the main competitor of Siemens and Philips in China, United Imaging, they launched the world's first full-body scanner using this world's strongest magnet as this moment, which is 5 Tesla. And 5 days ago, this technology was cleared by the American Food and Drug Administration. And so this is how far Chinese companies already got with the help of the government support.
All right, thanks a lot, Sanne. We'll certainly come back to that as well. I want to bring in Martin Catarata. He is a senior consultant with Synalytics, a consultancy based in Berlin. And Martin, you have penned together with me a chapter on technical standard setting, but in this podcast, I would rather ask you a bit from the perspective of your day job as a consultant, because you deal with European companies facing this situation where the Chinese party state is, as Sana just very elaborately explained, interfering to the benefit of Chinese technology companies. And the question to me is, from your experience, what is it that European companies in this specific environment, a competitive environment, actually expect from public actors, from the EU, but also from member state governments or the United Kingdom?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think from what we hear also from our clients, there are several pain points that European companies are currently facing with regard to tank competition with China, both from competition within China, but obviously also increasingly from competition with China in third countries, which has been picking up over the last few years. I think the first thing to mention is that on the Chinese market, it is still quite restrictive in many aspects for European tech companies. So discriminatory public procurement rules that the Chinese government, by the way, also recently affirmed still exists in China, as well as continued localization requirements are just two examples that need to be addressed and can be addressed by also public actors in bilateral talks between the EU and Chinese officials. I think a second aspect is that is quite a big pain point for the companies that we are talking to, that China has been strongly restricting cross-border data flows over the last few years, although we do see some easing on this front lately. However, continued access to data from China remains not only important for the daily operation of companies that have set up, for example, R&D centers in China, but is also very important in order to gain access to the vast amounts of data that China has to offer. The third point that I want to mention in terms of competition with Chinese players in third markets, what we see is that the Chinese government is very actively supporting companies in their internationalization efforts. So, for example, they are quite active in terms of free trade agreements. Over the last 2 years, they have set up quite a lot of agreements with third countries that obviously also benefits their digital tech companies. From our perspective, European public actors should also strive to improve or increase their support for opening up new markets for European technology, for example, through improved cooperation with third countries. The fourth point that I want to mention, and Sanne, I think you already laid this out quite well, is that Chinese tech companies obviously benefit strongly from substantial subsidies for research and development through to setting up production facilities. While the EU should not, or companies are not expecting that the EU is replicating China's vast industrial policy program, investments into Europe's innovation capacities should definitely be increased. And lastly, the last point that I want to make is that the EU should also improve the support for European companies participating in international standard setting. Chinese companies receive very generous financial as well as coordination support for participating and developing international standards that is quite hard to match for private European companies.
Thanks, Martin. And finally, I want to bring in, of course, John Seaman, who's a research fellow at IFRI, the French Institute of International Relations. You have conducted an interesting case study on critical raw materials. So the critical minerals that we hear about because we are so reliant on China, both for the digital transition, but also actually for many technologies of the green transition. We keep hearing about these minerals rather from the point of weakness that we depend on China. But now Digital Power China has penned a paper to sort of understand a bit how we can get from this sort of more reactive mode to a more proactive mode where we think about our strengths and our and how we can shape the international development. And the question here is, walk us a bit through what can policymakers in such an unlikely case that critical raw materials certainly are for European strength, what can they do? Where is there any potential for strength, and what's the role of public actors?
That's a very good question. And I have to admit that when you first came to us with this project and framed things in the way that JP talked about in terms of leverage and reverse dependencies and what Europe can do, it seemed like the quick question was nothing. But after delving into the topic quite a bit, the approach that we found useful was actually to look into the Chinese text and to look at what the conversation in China is about China's own vulnerabilities, China's own dependencies, and where Europe might be able to find some space within that. And so naturally, we think, China dominates supply chains for rare earths, for batteries, for solar PV, this sort of thing. And the energy and green transition and the digital transition are only going to reinforce these dependencies, and things are going to get worse. So how can we actually flip the script? And I think it's interesting really to look at one notion that comes out in the Chinese academic debates, which is this notion of shortage minerals. So we talk a lot about how China has its own advantage, and it has a category that Chinese academics like to talk about, advantageous minerals. But there's this concept of shortage minerals, where essentially, sure, China can dominate pieces of the supply chain for batteries, for instance, but it still has to go overseas to find cobalt, nickel, lithium. For instance, cobalt, it depends 95% on foreign imports for cobalt raw material. So it can master all the transformation of cobalt that it wants, but it still has to go overseas to get them. Same thing for nickel. 3/4 of lithium, the lithium that China consumes comes from overseas, particularly from Australia. Australia is a big player in that. And it's the same story for copper. 3/4 of the copper that China needs to drive forward its digital and its green energy transition comes from overseas. So starting from this observation, essentially that China is vulnerable and China is dependent, that is sort of an opening for how we can think about maybe Europe has a role to play. And when you look in the sources of basically how China categorizes these vulnerabilities, there are really sort of two drivers for it. One is local politics, local conditions. So you look at policies like the Indonesian government took in 2020, for instance, to ban the export of raw nickel. That necessarily impacts China's decision making, and China has to be reactive to that. You've seen the Chilean government come out with similar initiatives to create a national a national company for lithium. And you've seen the Democratic Republic of Congo also being a very tough negotiator in terms of access to cobalt. So these are local conditions. But then the other side of the coin that we see a lot of in the Chinese discussions are the geopolitical conditions. So this sort of awakening that we're having in the United States or here in Europe or in Japan or elsewhere to essentially say we have to put in place policies to guarantee our own supplies. And that changes the dynamics of how we relate to producing countries. In that sense, China's relationship with producing countries then becomes much more complex because China has to react to what European diplomacy is going to do. And in that, I think there is definitely a space where Europe can invest in a much more proactive mining diplomacy and work a lot more closely with producing countries to be able to insert itself in this emerging and developing market for critical raw materials. And in that sense, maybe not leverage or dependency, but at least enact some level of influence within what we consider to be critical raw materials, and to sort of temper a bit China's more dominant position.
Thanks, John. Before I go to the final round where I'll ask all of you for one policy recommendation, I'd like to very briefly tease Jan Peter again with one additional question. And because we have heard sort of from Sana how the Chinese state is proactively engaging. We have heard from Martin a bit sort of what the expectations from companies are to state actors. We've heard sort of the problematic case of critical raw materials from John, and I'd like to bring in again you with sort of a final question here on sort of what is it really that states can do then, European states can do? I mean, research is conducted by companies or research organizations. Products are commercialized and produced by companies. Patents are being held mostly also by non-public actors, by private actors, by companies first and foremost. And then I think many react with sort of two ways: either industrial policy, investing a lot, subsidizing a lot, or with protecting European public private actors with protect tools. Is that helpful? Is that conducive from your perspective, or where in this very privately dominated European approach, where do states fit then in light of what we heard from the others?
That's an interesting question. I mean, just to make sure the the same challenges everybody else except China faces, right? Like the same question is also relevant for the Japanese government or the US government. What is actually their role? And I think currently the discourse quickly focuses on export controls, on subsidies, but I think we need a much more granular understanding of this. So for example, if we want to ensure that in my area, lithography equipment, Europe stays the most competitive place on Earth, so to speak, for R&D and a broader lithography ecosystem. It goes into how to acquire foreign talent and skills. So it's about immigration policies. It goes into the educational system. It also goes into all the different research frameworks and policies that Europe has to ensure that there's pan-European collaboration for lithography, not just equipment, but broader lithography technologies. Then another thing is maybe counterintuitively, if we want to, in the long term, if we want to make sure that China stays entangled with Europe and that there are reverse dependencies, European lithography technology needs to be or needs to continue to be easily accessible to Chinese fabs, to Chinese companies. So there is a very tricky balance to strike between ensuring that Chinese fabs are incentivized to continue to buy lithography equipment versus striking or defining a clear threshold, what type of lithography equipment should not be exported. And in order to do that, I think it became clear, looking at what some European governments did in their own assessment so far, that just getting this threshold right for lithography equipment is already a challenge. Doing that now for other technology areas necessitates also technical expertise in the ministries, and that directly feeds into the question, how should governments build this up? Should this all be internal capacity, hiring tech experts across the technology ecosystems? Most likely not. Most likely it also needs a step change in the way how European governments engage with the private sector, with consultancies, with think tanks, in order to come to grips with technology trajectories, technological dependencies in the different ecosystems. That would also necessitate a change in how ministries do business and how ministries engage with independent analysis. So I see a host of areas where governments should become active, are already becoming active, or need to step up their game in order to actually have, let's say, a more geotech mindset, in a sense that they understand technology ecosystems, identify the relevant policy areas where they can bring meaningful change and set the right conditions. And third, not just do this on a one-off basis. So now all the hype is lithography, and then 1-2 years down the road, nobody talks about it anymore, which would be sad. That actually build up the internal capacity, but also the broader network of independent analysis to have an influx of knowledge into the government, into the ministries, to continuously inform the relevant policy units. I think baby steps have been made on this way, on this long journey, but I think there is a lot of headroom.
Thanks, JP. And I think that already leads to our final round, and I'll go in reverse order and ask, as already suggested, to John to go first and sort of give us one policy recommendation that you find most relevant that European policymakers should implement.
Thanks, Tim. I think what really stands out from our analysis is what Europe needs to do is invest much more heavily and much more strategically into mining and resource diplomacy, to be able to leverage in some ways its existing expertise, but also to develop that expertise as well. So Europe has a very long mining tradition, but a lot of the skills that we've had are aging. They're becoming obsolete in some ways. We need to sort of reinvest in our own mining capacities, but then also invest in diplomacy to be able to leverage those in partnerships and strategic partnerships with overseas partners and with producing states overseas. And in many ways, this what we need to look for is a complementarity between our own needs for diversification of supply chains and local needs in producing states to generate quality, sustainable development and generate opportunities for their own growth and development. And so this goes through, using technologies such as AI and satellite technologies to do prospecting for various minerals. It goes through skill development programs, downstream supply chain development programs in various partner countries, and also just a reinforcement of sustainable standards, environmental, labor, governance standards, and working also with other partners such as the United States or Japan or other demand side partners to sort of be on board and converge on a level of standards that are both acceptable to us, but also acceptable to producing states themselves. And so I think we need to take on board much more the concerns of local producing states, and in some ways use the critical raw material question as a platform to renew and to deepen Europe's relationships with the global South, which I think have become quite strained in recent years. But to do that, we need to be on the listening side as well.
Thanks, John. Over to you, Martin. What is your one take that European policymakers should implement?
Thanks, Tim. I will also be answering this then from the perspective of our joint chapter that we have co-written on standardization efforts. So from my perspective, European public actors should enact policies that help European technology companies to continue to be featured in international standard setting organizations to ensure continuing soft dependency of China on European technology that technical standards can definitely provide. That includes, for example, keeping global markets open for European companies through, for example, incentivizing adoption of international standards through the EU's Global Connectivity Initiative, for example, but obviously also through, as I mentioned earlier, through free trade agreements, for example. To match also the level of activity by Chinese actors, European policymakers should also provide conditions to incentivize private companies to participate in international standard setting, for example, reducing the costs of participation for those companies. That would be my policy recommendation.
Sanne, over to you.
Yeah, it may sound a bit counterintuitive, but we believe that European policymakers should make sure that European companies can keep investing in China, and then both including in local manufacturing, but also in R&D, because China is the place to be for AI development, and European companies need to stay close to that, but also because the Chinese market is very important for European companies for their profits. And they need their profits to invest in R&D in order to be able to stay front runners in this case, medical imaging.
Thanks a lot. And then JP, you already gave us sort of a bit of a sense of what is necessary to do, but maybe you have another policy recommendation to end with.
Yeah, maybe keeping in the spirit from Sanne with counterintuitive recommendations. I think two key recommendations would be that Europe does not take its strength in lithography equipment for granted, because there's this current perception that, of course, nobody can compete with ASML in certain types of lithography tools, but within the industry, there's also a very strong conviction that in 10, 20 years' time, the Chinese industry will have EUV or EUV-like systems. And the only question is, will they have it with European technology or without European technology? So I think a key consideration for European policymakers should be how to stay entangled, how to ensure that 10 years down the road, there is still reverse dependency. And that would entail that European equipment suppliers and component suppliers might need to continue to cooperate with the Chinese ecosystem, because the Chinese ecosystem now is basically on a path to accelerate domestic substitution. And that train kind of lost the station. So it's clear that they will do everything they can to be as independent of US, Japanese, and European technology as possible. And this might not be in our best long-term interest. So I think a key consideration should be to stay entangled, stay engaged in the Chinese ecosystem, and understand in which areas even technology cooperation might be necessary to ensure that reverse dependencies exist even in the long term.
Thank you, JP. Thank you to all the four of you. It has really been fascinating. If you agree with me that this has been a fascinating conversation, then don't hesitate to check out the new full version of the Digital Power China report that is online now at the website of the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, but also of that of other contributing institutions. And you will also find a link here on social media to check it out. Thank you so much for your interest. Thank you to the four speakers, and see you soon.